All were angry and many were frightened, and they converged on City Hall demanding and pleading, and more than 200 were hauled off to the station house. The first cases of AIDS in the United States were reported in 1981. By 1983 there were over 1,000 reported cases in the U.S., and by that point already half had proven fatal. Unlike other high mortality rate viruses like Ebola, HIV tended not to be something may eventually recover from once infected. Part of the slowed government response was because of the epidemic curve of the HIV virus. Unlike Ebola virus, it was gradual, with symptoms appearing in a matter of years instead of days. It's easier for epidemiologists to encourage behavior changes in a population for an in-your-face disease like smallpox or Ebola virus, but AIDS, despite its near 100 mortality rate, was so slow-moving that not only was mass behavior change difficult to encourage, most people who spread the virus did not themselves even know that they were infected. Drug use was a risk factor. Unprotected sex was also a risk factor. But many risk factors were not in people's control. For instance, the 1980s was not a great time to be a hemophiliac. But another aspect was the factor that the epicenter of the outbreak was not in middle-class, straight white families, but the gay community in urban centers like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City. Since all of the earliest cases were discovered in gay men, it was easy for lawmakers to moralize the outbreak, not just as a sexually transmitted disease, but also of moral degeneracy. Pat Buchanan, who was the leader of White House communications at the time, wrote about AIDS. Reagan didn't seem to understand the seriousness of the epidemic until his friend Rock Hudson announced that he was HIV positive 4 years into the epidemic. But even then it wasn't enough to get the administration to act on it. Dr. Donald Francis, an epidemiologist within the CID, assigned to the AIDS outbreak, later wrote, "Much like firefighters confronting a fire, early aggressive action pays off, whereas slow passive action leads to massive destruction." The CID, with the help of Francis, developed a comprehensive plan in 1985 to help stop the spread of HIV, which had by now infected thousands. But the Reagan administration rejected it outright. The administration told epidemiologists within the CID to look pretty and do as little as possible. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop was explicitly banned by the Reagan administration from addressing the AIDS crisis when in 1986 he broke with orders and did address what was by now a pandemic. He was attacked from within all areas of the administration. The powers that be within the CID refused to stand up to their bosses higher up in the Reagan administration. Director of the CID James Mason, regarding the CID's failure to act, later said, "By the late 1980s, with now hundreds of thousands of new cases of HIV, it wasn't an issue of passivity, but of active obstruction." An increasingly popular narrative surrounding the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s was that there was nothing to be done to stop it, that the onus was solely on the infected, and there was nothing but their own behavior to blame. And there we are solely on the surround the there 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 But the spread of HIV/AIDS in the United States was not inevitable, and had the powers that be acted sooner, millions of lives could have been saved. This is what happens when governments fail the people they are sworn to protect. Healthcare is a right. Healthcare is a right. Healthcare is a right. So, yeah, anyway, today we going to talk about rent. Let he among us without sin be the first to condemn. Well, fortunately, I have literally never sinned. I have literally never sinned. So condemn away a shawl. Okay, so here's the thing. Full disclosure, I have always hated Rent for basically the same reason I hate reality bites. Yes, even before the movie came out, and yes, despite the fact that I lived in the East Village of New York City the first time I saw it on Broadway and was surrounded by rent heads, or hell, maybe even because of that. And the other thing is, the older I get, the more things I find about Rent that annoy me. Like when I was a freshman at U, I was like surrounded by these rent heads who were like it meant, and I'm like, well, I guess you're not completely wrong, trust fund babies. And then later, I eventually burned a bridge over someone who insisted that Rent was beyond criticism because Jonathan Larson died of AIDS. He didn't. And even if he did, no, I actually won the ticket lottery for this sucker twice. So, sorry stage show apologists, I'm not here for you. This ain't a stage show good movie a bad kind of episode, so hunker down be all. Not to mention, of course, hating dear old mom and dad. Thing is, the moviedos exist in a realm of bad, partially separated from the stage show by virtue of adaptation sickness, and it is not a good adaptation, but a lot of me problems with Rent as a whole. So this one goes out to all the people who asked me to deconstruct Rent like I did with Schumacher's Phantom, and to you I say, I can't. Sorry. Hey, mister. She's me sister. And the truth about Rent's adaptation is it's not really that inept. I mean, although there are some decisions that are like, what? You re what you are. But the thing that makes Rent the movie a fail is the same basic affliction Phantom suffered from. The filmmakers didn't know how to translate the stage musical effectively. And similar to what we discussed with the Phantom adaptation, its main failure is stripping the source material of the theatrical elements that make it flow and replacing it with, mostly montages. From the soul of a young man. Though the soul of a young A young man. Some on-screen dialogue. You want me to be your slave. You want me to just obey your every wish. More scenes, less singing, setting leases on fire. But in the end, it has more in common with the adaptation of Les Mis than Phantom. It's just kind of a boring musical made by a boring filmmaker who never seemed terribly comfortable with the material. Oh well, and in fairness to the original work, the movie is much more ungood than the Broadway show. And it is important to note that Rent is one of the first mainstreamish works with any kind of substantial representation. And hey, this is also one of the rare representations of a bisexual character, although she, of course, is the slutting Slutterson who wants to slut it up with every living human. Because, there will always be women in rubber flirting with me. Rent was a step. It was a step in helping to humanize the old community and urban centers to a broader audience who might not have humanized them otherwise. You know, I'm not here to deny that. That said, I don't have much nice to say about Rent, so if it was, like, integral to your childhood or something, you probably might want to sit this one out. Rent. If there was one wrong directorial choice to embody the countercultural discontent of the Youngs, it was Chris Columbus. Fresh off voice of a generation, avant-garde tentpoles like Home Alone, Mrs. Doubtfire, and the first two Harry Potters. Hell, maybe that's why Benny, the alleged sellout, is, unlike the stage show, easily the most sympathetic character in the movie. Columbus is like, here's a guy who knows what's up. If you want to produce films and write songs, you need somewhere to do it. Invest your money wisely, Benny, and use that money to fund your passion project 5 years from now. And meanwhile, your old friends will still be poor and wondering why the cruel, cruel world is forcing them to pay rent to live in a building. Anyway, I can't speak to your local community theater production of Rent, but the problems that most people have with Rent are not necessarily unique to the movie. Mark, are you there? Are you screening your call? Are you screening your call? It's Mom. Hi. I just wanted to call and say we love you. But they are certainly more pronounced. There are times when we read dirt broke and hungry and freezing, and I ask myself, why the hell am I still living here? And then they call. Phew, Mark. God, this Fing movie awakes the inner walker-wielding granny in me yelling at these kids to get off me lawn. And these damned kids are from the generation before mine. So yeah, the reason why Rent the movie fails has a lot in common with why Phantom the movie did not work. But, you know, we've already covered that ground. I'm more interested in Rent as part of the grander, countercultural canon. Do you feel left behind by the system? A system that, say, doesn't take your art seriously, or maybe failed to act on an epidemic before it became a pandemic. A system that profited off life-saving drugs, that failed to fund research. There were over 140 drugs out there that the FDA has identified as possibilities, that stigmatized the sick, that looked the other way when hundreds of thousands of people in our own country were dropping dead. I think we'd all like a generation-defining musical that really takes the system to task. But Rent ain't it. Oh, Mama who bore a man. Mama who gave me no weight to handle things, who made me so sad the stage musical is a popular format to try and capture the discontent of the something. It is the music of a people who will not be slaves again. We have been left behind by the system. The musical. There's a lot of those. But Rent is literally based on the first we have been left behind by the system. The musical. Oh no, Camilionario se fa segno il buon Dio l'abom was the original that Puccini Slabom was arguably the start of the mainstream countercultural fight in the man musical. It is the basis of not only Rent, but many modern films and musicals. Most notably Moulin Rouge, which although based on La Traviata, borrows arguably more from Beaumont than Traviata, or the film from which it takes its name, but not its exclamation point. I just summarize the plot, but it's basically identical to Rent. Swap out tuberculosis with AIDS, the Latin Quarter with Alphabet City, the 1840s with the 1980s, and Americanify the characters' names a bit. I'm Roger Puccini's Bohème was popular because its characters were relatable, and the story was emotionally charged. The real revelation here is that his opera is about an underclass. He isn't writing about kings or dukes, but about starving artists who feel that they've been left behind. It is truly a universal story, translatable to any era. Phantom of the Opera also draws a lot of inspiration from Bohème in that it goes a long way with raw, simple, shallow emotionality. But the difference between Phantom and Rent is Phantom was trying to make a grand statement about society. And the truth is La Bohème isn't either. Not really. It exists more in the same vein as Moulin Rouge. You read the voice of the children of the revolution. But what is the revolution? I mean, it's not a socialist revolution, or a class revolution, or a We have freedom, beauty, truth, and love. Okay. See, they use terms like revolution in Moulin Rouge, but really, it's about emotionality with an artistic movement set as the backdrop. Shows like this have romantic ideas in the guise of revolution, but none of them challenge any existing power structures in a way that might alienate the wealthy audience, especially as portrayed in the movie. In Cyberland, we only drink. We only do literally Diet Coke. Yeah, that all show the man. Look at those monocles poppin' everywhere. Every decade sorta had its own. The 1960s had hair, the 70s Jesus Christ Superstar, 80s had Los Mis, 90s had Rent, 2000s wanted to have Spring Awakening, but really they had Avenue Club. They all tried to capture the voice of the class of youngs that feel left out of the system. Although all of these are what George Ishikawa has called bourgeois or finished theater. In other words, they frame themselves as revolutionary, but continue to push the voice worldview and values of the status quo. In this case, middle-class white kids who want to pass off their home movies as true art. From here on in, I shoot without a script. Without a script. Oh, Mark, you visionary. See, this is what I mean when I say that Rent's primary purpose is to validate a certain subsect of the theater going public rather than bring any theater of the oppressed to the masses. This is an idea developed by revolutionary Brazilian dramatist Augusto Boal, who developed the idea of theater of the oppressed. And Boal takes a Marxist reading to pretty much all theater on this subject, so bear that in mind. Echoing Marx, Boal argues that the dominant art is the art of the dominant class, who control the means to disseminate art. In this case, Broadway shows. All of these shows revolve around the social discontent of some underclass, But the shows did not reach the mainstream because some underclass propelled them there. Rent did claw its way up from off-Broadway, yes, but only because it found success with the people who had money. Only thing to do is jump over the moon. Hamilton is a perfect example of this phenomenon in action right now. High demand and extremely limited quantities mean that only the wealthy control access to the stage show. A lottery system does exist that sells tickets for $10, but there are 21 of these tickets per show and thousands of entrants. Real access comes in the form of people with thousands of dollars to drop on tickets. And because Broadway shows are so uniquely expensive in terms of consumable art, they have to walk a fine line between being trendy, maybe even a little edgy, but not enough to put the people with money outside of their comfort zones. It presents a multiculti hip-hop narrative about the life of Alexander Hamilton and the foundation of the country, but it is ultimately really reassuring about the American experiment. Who lives? Whoodies, who tells your story? Who lives? Whoodies, who tells your story? The ruling class does. You remember you belong to me. If you want people to hear your message, it first has to get the okay from your wealthy patrons. I mean, it's no coincidence that the first hip-hop musical to become a huge hit happens to be about the whitest thing ever. And Hamilton is excellent, don't get me wrong. It's just not here to challenge any ideas on American exceptionalism or start any revolutions. I am with you, but the situation is fraught. You've got to be carefully taught. If you talk, you're gonna get shot. Does every musical need to necessarily challenge the culture it's trying to sell itself to? God, no. I mean, how else would I see Phantom for the 20th time? One time only. But anyway, not every musical, even the ones with explicit revolutionary text, needs to be trying to tear down the system. But what would a revolution look like if it had been included in Rent rather than the subtext being reject the system instead of change it? Well, probably what was going down in Alphabet City in the 80s in the real world. Thousands of demonstrators demand that New York City do more to help those suffering from AIDS. Protests, societal upheaval, all those unpretty things that were very much going on during the AIDS crisis, they were not designed to make the type of person with hundreds of dollars to drop on a Broadway show ticket comfortable. Do you think we really accomplished a great deal? Yes, I think we do. What else can we do? But Lowell's Miss does not position itself in opposition to the culture it is trying to sell itself to. Neither does Hamilton. But Rent does. And if your musical spends its entirety dressing down the funny baloney culture while at the same time kind of being its very embodiment, then we may need to have words. Rent the Broadway musical was met with much more universal acclaim. Rent the Broadway musical was met with much more universal acclaim than Bohem a century prior. It wasn't for another couple of years until we started seeing pushback against Rent. The movie was what made society as a whole really start to turn on Rent. So thank you for that movie. See, Rent's heyday came and went, and a few more years passed, and then another few more years passed, and then they threw another few years on for posterity. And they made the movie with the original cast. So by the time the movie comes out, it's like, yeah, sure, you in your 20s. And they went hard trying to keep the original cast, which was just weird. Rosario Dawson and Tracy Thoms are the only people who seem happy to be here. Everyone else is in their 30s, and they've moved on with their careers, but here they are pretending to be in their early 20s, and it's weird. Many of the songs are cut and turned into dialogue, which makes for an even draggier experience than it might have been. Even with the opening number, when they are asking themselves how we gonna pay next year's rent. rent, 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 rent. Rent, 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 rent. The music is arranged similarly to the show's, which is a group number. But in the show, everyone in the neighborhood does, and all collectively decide to stop paying rent at the same time. It's more like, like a Greek chore type thing. Like a Greek chore, unlike in the movie where it appears to be Ariat. And like, okay, so Benny turns off their heat. Right. So they have to burn their precious art creations for warmth. So they're to their precious oi 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 sorry. This is also lifted directly from La Boheme. This is how that starts. Burning our art for warmth. It's like an irony thing. But then they throw it out the window. I mean, the whole thing is full of adaptive changes that don't really stand up to modest scrutiny. Joanne and Marian's relationship never gets resolved in the movie. Like, they break up and then are together again at the end when they find Mimi. I guess they get back together off screen somewhere. This works better in the show because they break up and get back together constantly, and that's the joke. The movie starts with Seasons of Love, which is an odd decision as the whole point of that song is that it happens after intermission to impart that a year has passed. So at the front of the movie, it's just like a song that's the song, the front stuff of the but people know it, so let's start with that. I guess. Lots of 2005 vehicles here in 1989. Nobody has 80s hair. Mark's camera has no sound recording apparatus. Why are we taking a train to life support if everything's in Alphabet City? A neighborhood with no train access. Roger returns to Manhattan from Santa Fe via the Williamsburg Bridge. Some of the worst weather breath in history of movieism. Lazy, uncreative use of your setting. Or just strange use of setting. Is he about to try to sell me a really manly truck? There are a lot of problems with rent that are movie-specific, but me interest is more comprehensive. And it starts with the fact that with the Dorothy and Toto went over the rainbow to blow off fancy air. Rent is a musical about selfish, horrible people, framed like freedom fighters. They show profound entitlement over other people's rights and property, but it is framed like romantic rebelliousness. A restaurant owner begs them, "Please don't patronize our restaurant. Please. Please do. Our Please, no, no, not tonight. Please leave." They then ignore him when he asks them not to move the tables around. "Please don't move the tables." "Hey, Rosie, let's put these tables together." "No, no, no, no." Marion is an emotionally abusive cheater who gaslights all of her partners. Engel comes into wealth at the beginning by killing a dog. But sure as I am here, that dog is now in doggy hell. Mimi is a self-destructive codependent enabler. Collins honors the memory of his dead lover by hotwiring a local Atmito dispense cash for him and his friends when you plug his name in. I rewired the Atmat, the food employee. Now he needs the code on Gil. And Mark. Sweet Mark. You might be the worst thing to have ever happened. And you are. I am just here too, to appropriate your tragedy for me art without having obtained permission. I hope that's cool. Rent the movie really has two stories that don't mesh when you give it more than a passing thought. The story of the tragic AIDS havers and the love triangle between Joan, Mark, and Maureen. And these two things have nothing to do with each other besides that they know each other. But really, Mark and Maureen, while they feel bad for the AIDS havers, I guess their stories are more about their poetry and their art. I gotcha. Gotcha, 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 gotcha. Mark has his aimless documentary and Maureen her terrible performance art. Both have loving support structures and come from wealthy families, and none of these people have AIDS or really any reason not to pay the rent other than the fact that they feel they shouldn't have to because art and selling out are something. And I ask myself, why the hell am I still living here? Fuck you. You know that song, Common People. Still, you'll never get it right. It's when you relate in bed at night watching roaches climb the wall. If you called your dad, he could stop it. Oh, ye wall, look, Mark. Someone wrote a song about you. In the show, it's more obvious that Maureen is terrible and kind of a narcissist. And this is really a pastiche of bad performance art. Gotcha, gotcha. Gotcha, 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 gotcha. Gotcha, gotcha. Gotcha, cha-cha, gotcha. But in the movie it is played dead fucking straight. And the suits are in the audience blown away by how real she is. Moo with me laterate. No. They re-mooing with her. Now, the fact that they are horrible need not be a problem. I need your help to make my neighbor's yappy dog disappear. Or even that their horribleness goes unexamined by the characters. That is, after all, a condition of human behavior. But the problem, like the Fawkes revolutionary subtext, is with the framing. The show doesn't really go anywhere with this. This type of character is much more effectively explored in Trainspotting. In Trainspotting, you are made to relate to the characters. Sure, but it makes no pretense of them being idealists or good people. It much more successfully dresses down the phoniness of the society that they reject. Choose life, choose a job, choose a career, choose a family, choose a fucking big television, choose washing machines, cars, compact displayers, and electrical tin openers. But at the same time, it doesn't dress them up like they are legitimately too good for society. They are very obviously not. So, Rent presents us with a worldview that validates the characters rather than challenges them. And romantic validation is part of what made Rent so popular. Similar to Bowen before it. But there are ways that this sort of thing can be, maybe a little contradictory. Yes, we are so countercultural like in this scene. The nadir of the film, where they dance on the table while the pure cloching suits are scandalized by the interests of the Bohemians. Like who of us rancheros. Eating disorders. Woo. Rent's primary theme comes from the conflict between Bohemian ideals and selling out for financial security. What rent? This past year's rent which I let slide. They don't want to pay rent because their friend who owns the building has reneged on a deal he made with them that they can live there rent-free. But there is this underlying entitlement that these guys have that they shouldn't have to pay rent because they re artists and they don't sell out. Get off my lawn. Because working for a show like Buzzline is completely selling out. Mark has among the worst resolution to his subplot. Particularly frustrating to those of us working in journalism today. Start at $3,000. He works for a sort of proto-style news organization and makes bank doing it, but he doesn't like having a job in his chosen field of study because selling out. I sold me soul. Oh, poor baby. You have to work your way up from a job you don't really like in your chosen field that pays really well as a starting point for your career. If I need to finish me own film, I quit. Mark, you are the worst. There is a big homeless subplot, but it's much bigger in the stage show than the movie. No room at the Holiday Inn, oh no. But the big thing that is pointed out by this character, but goes oddly unexamined, is the fact that none of these people really care about the homeless. Who do you think you are? I don't need no goddamn help from some bleeding heart cameraman. My life's not for you to make a name for yourself for. Easy, sugar, easy. He was just trying. Just trying to use me to kill his guilt. Mark getting called out on it doesn't prompt any change in behavior. Maureen really doesn't give a shit about their plight. She only cares about her performance space not being taken from her. The tent city is just a backdrop. The problem with the theme of selling out for security versus adhering to your precious ideals while living in poverty, with the backdrop of a massive homeless subplot which was not there in La Boheme, by the by, that it infers that poverty is a choice, and a noble one at that. Which sure, Mark has a choice as to whether or not to live in poverty. Pretty much all of the characters do, except Angel and Collins. But the homeless do not choose to live on the street in order to uphold their bohemian ideals. So right there we have thematic dissonance number one. Dissonance. So right there we have the they're Choosing to live in poverty and romanticizing it while surrounded by those living in poverty who do not have a choice, and are repulsed by your romanticizing their tragedy. Mark. Hey, artist, you got $1. Didn't think so. Yeah, this prompts no change in him, and is the last time it gets brought up. The second major theme is that of affliction. La Boheme is set against the backdrop of tuberculosis, rentifacids, which afflicts far more characters in Rent than embedded in Boheme. So when you have the one over here and the me too over here, this is where we really start kind of running into problems. Mark Cohen's character arc played up in the movie to the point where, unlike in the show, he is the explicit protagonist, reminds me so much of Lelane in Reality Bites. They both exploit their parents, neither want to sell out their precious art or play by the rules of fucking society, steal shit. No, they'll get away with any rules broken because they re-white kids who come from wealthy families, and their approach to documentary is just shoot whatever and call it art because it exists and made it. From here on in, I shoot without a script. To quote Nathan Rabin, last time he checked, those are called home fucking movies and nobody thinks that's higher art. So we suffer in the cold and ignore our loving families because suffering equals art, and the homeless are suffering, and we like them because suffering equals art, and as long as they don't expect us to recognize their needs as humans, then hey, maybe they don't think suffering is all that artistic. You assholes. So in Rent, poverty, despite being confronted on how shitty it is to appropriate someone else's suffering, Mark is always justified because art and capitalist society is always out to consume you, which is why you own nothing, you rent, therefore you are always justified in taking anything you can from society. I rewired the AdMat the food employee. It's not stealing because you an artist and the rules don't apply to you. You know poverty is not romantic. Just throwing it out there. Anyway, let's see that back in with the theme of affliction. Affliction no day but today. A big theme in Rent is presented in the no day but today motive, with the central conflict of Mimi and Roger's relationship being planning for an uncertain future versus living for the now. Problem here is Rent doesn't try to find a balance, but rather that planning for the future thing tends to be painted in a more negative light, especially where Benny is concerned. You make fun, yet fine. The one attempting to do some good, or do you really want a neighborhood where people piss on you stoop every night? The no day but today motive is seen in the life support group No Day But Today and in the interactions between Roger and Mimi. A bad idea of a relationship that at least one of them gets some bad juju about, but here we go anyway. Your smile reminded me I always remind people of it's almost like I have a type, and I'm drawn to self-destructive addicts. See, Roger's ex-girlfriend committed suicide after finding out that both she and Roger have AIDS. The suicide part's not clear in the movie, by the by. His girlfriend April left a note saying we got AIDS before slitting her wrists in the bathroom, so the first time we see the no day but today motive is used at Angel's life support meeting. In the very next scene, we see it again when Mimi is trying to get Roger to do drugs with her. Forget, regret, all life is yours to miss. There is an honesty here, like that Roger wants to be with her but isn't allowing himself to because he's afraid to live, and Mimi's trying to get him to open up. However, this doesn't really work because this very simple framing, the fact that Mimi is on the side of the life support people and therefore in the moral right, is undercut by the fact that she's trying to enable a newly clean person to do drugs with her. Take your powder, take your candle, your sweet whisper, I just can't handle the film frames it like Roger is refusing to live when in reality he has a very good reason not to want to spend any time with Mimi, namely, that of staying clean, and in that regard has much more in common with the people at the life support meeting than with Mimi. Excuse me if I'm off track, but if you re so wise, then tell me, why do you need smack? There no day but today accepts that any day could be their last, but that doesn't mean they re not going to take care of themselves now. Mimi's attitude is that you should live for today instead of taking care of yourself and planning for the future, because you can die at any moment, so you may as well live for the moment and do whatever. I'm at this moment as me laughs the show does this too, perhaps more pointedly because rather than Roger Spuds plus Mimi being the chorus, a choice which makes no logical sense by the way Mimi doesn't really know any of these people except Angel, but whatever in the stage show, the chorus is the entire life support group. No day but today take your powder, take your candle, so the show does the same thing, only you know more. Roger did. Vote. While the line, while the dollar, while the line, and then the line. Just the past couple of months' rent's biggest departure from La Boheme is the ending scene. Boheme ends like this, and Bent ends like this, and the play ends this way too. I was heading towards this warm white light, and I swear, Angel, why, there's, there, by and also over the bio bio I was you, bio you do fail, bio, you, bio, you, the you feel, well, well, there's a you, well, I am you, bio. Why you way of you why am you cause why does Mimi D in La Boheme but miraculously gets an AIDS reprieve because Roger sings a song at her I Have Always Loved You in La Boheme. Mimi is a symbol of innocence and purity, and she just can't survive in this tough new bohemian world that. Oh, and she looked good, but I don't think that is really the end of it. I think in Rent it's and Jivi Pazali who easy. That's the Mimi, because Angel Jet's the angelic Mimi death. Angel D. Pazatitu. Pazin. Pazin. Pazis the deal. Pan. Pan you deal. The zeal. Pan. Pan the deal. Pan. 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 Positive, alive, but you better you perceive, I will, I do, I do you, do you, but the but more flower, I is a seal and the, but the house, but the shoe, but I am zeal, by the, by you, zeal, by the zeal, there. When I realize I am you, I am out of you, and I am the deal you, I am the I am the you, I am I view, I view, I view, I view thee, I view, I view you, I view you, oh, yeah, I do as you, because I was as you, as you. Are you because you shoot? Is this a new way to start a new year? Oh, have compassion, and there is a much bigger sense of active agency but Chris Columbus. Interpretation does not exist in a character in her own right just to be inspiration for everyone else and act as like a spirit. Guide after Shady's angel is their Chris Columbus. Embodiment of goodness and humanity, is more of a prop than one of the main thing characters. You know it's like in Pocahontas, where they were so obsessed with being respectful that she has literally no character flaws or character period. And I think part of that is that Chris Columbus never seems entirely comfortable with this character just from a cinematography standpoint. Take the curious decision to shoot I'll cover you as boringly as they did it let passage of the Bassavel Bassavis Bella the but the what are you while the says a illusion well they the why the land why we do why well the zoo do but well but then while we why the way why well why well why well then well way why well the zoo can do why oh well we well we do what we do what we do always do well. What do you we do this is you we do where the view do where the view will be away. Well, this is actually an element from La Boheme where, instead of a dog, it's a parrot, so let's ignore that. So rather than Mimi, who in Boheme is the embodiment of goodness and innocence, in Rent she is the waif who needs to be saved from herself with love, and Angel, well, Angel becomes the tragic figure of goodness and love-deing because the world is too cruel and corrupt for her. So Angel's story is resolved with her becoming an angel, and at the end of the day, both in the stage show and in the movie, Angel is the character with the least of an arc, and she just kinda goes quietly into that good night, nobly not mad about it or anything. No one is mad at the system that has failed thy. And here's the thing about the theme of affliction. In the 1840 was on the line to thee, by the line, of all the land, was thee, of all way, by the line, was along the line, by the line, loses its sound, was the night, of the line, of the low, was on the night, the ceases, by, of the lion, of the day, the lose, by what if it loses? Did he lose it? There. All the lion. Did he said oh, did he? Why ever believe you? All the lion. Better then. Why? Did he? Oh, all the lead. Wallow, Wally, Wally, there's you, oh, there's you, why, that's you, Wally, Wally, why the Louis, what the lie, there's you, Wally, Wallow, they said, Wally, do, what the lie, I don't, Bella, oh, I love you, do you, there, did you, why, that way, oh, yeah, way, whoa, deal, only deal, why, they, whoa, why, why, volume, why, deal, oh, then the, why, oh, this is the, Roger, where were you? Mimi Chica. Roger, where were you? Don't make a fuss. Roger, where are you? To Mama. Roger, where are you? And honestly, the show is way worse for this, such to the point where I wonder if it isn't trying to highlight our hero's hypocrisy, as every but the two adore gays his family to go back to, and they also the only characters who really seem to have anything to do with AIDS activism. Angel in the form of his support group, but with Collins the best we get is this: expel me from a theory of actual reality, which we can infer has something to do with AIDS activism because of this. Actual reality. Act up. Fight it. He also hints that this is why he got expelled from MIT, and this is all just lines and subtext. This isn't really explicit, and this line in La Vie Boheme is the last we see of it, and in the end Collins honors Angel's memory not by doing anything useful but by robbing at. I rewired the atom at the food emporium. Now he needs a code on Nigeria. That'll get those extortiony drug prices down. Hey, how were every single one of you able to afford Osta anyway? Wasn't it like $8,000 a year in 1989? Ostbreak. Do you Bohemians all just have really good health insurance and nobody's talking about it because you don't want to admit you re part of the system? Or that you getting government assistance and you don't want to talk about that because system bad? I know that shit didn't just fall off the back of a truck. Rent's idea of a revolution is a purely symbolic one, and that's kind of the point. It's built to reinforce world views, not change anything. Because the reality of the AIDS epidemic was not romantic tragedy à la Mimi's inevitable fate in La Boheme. It was not manic pixie dream gaze going quietly into that good night, but it was fighting and scratching and clawing and quilting and demanding that their humanity be recognized and not devalued on basis of sexual orientation, which it very much was in 1989. The reality of the AIDS epidemic does not work as a fuck the system musical because rejecting the system was not what eventually changed it. What changed it was holding the system to account. You have the FDA giving you a drug. So far you've got asked. Which I can't take because it's far too toxic. The FDA says there is nothing else that is worth anything. That does not mean that there is no place for Rent or that you a bad person for liking it or that the music isn't catchy. But if you care about the subjects that it champions, Rent is hardly representative. And that's the real problem with Rent. It and its narrative has overshadowed and sanitized a painful, terrible, uncomfortable history that we still live in the shadow of. Go read Stage Struck by Sarah Skolman. It's on Amazon. Or go watch How to Survive a Plague. It's on Netflix. Or Angels in America. It's on BoGo. Or even fucking Dallas Beers Club. Yes. Has its own problems, but actually acknowledges the criminal shortcomings of every power structure in place during the height of the AIDS crisis. A light, user-friendly sort of anarchy does not work in a narrative about the AIDS crisis because there is nothing noble in extolling the virtues of quietly giving into your disease when there is a system right there that can help and is actively, even aggressively failing you, but you reject it because fuck the man. I'm not a part of your system. And threw it on the ground. I don't need your protease inhibitors. And that is what Rent the movie ends up being. Sympathetic to an underclass that was violently screwed by the system, but ultimately the embodiment of the voice of the ruling class. That is why a story about homelessness and the AIDS crisis ends up being about not selling out. It advocates for no revolution other than the revolution of whatever makes you as an individual feel good. It reinforces a worldview in which the only way to rebel against the system is to reject it. And it might feel good to throw it on the ground. And throw the rest of the cake too. It gives you a sense of power in a world that makes you feel powerless. But in reality, the only thing it fosters is actual powerlessness. Because in rejecting the system, you are not only failing to tear it down, you are also forfeiting any voice within it. Rent takes an inherently political issue and depoliticizes it to create something comforting and consumable. Rent looks pretty and does as little as possible. I'm starving for attention, hating convention, hating pretension, not to mention, of course, hating dear old mom and dad. Plague. We are in the middle of a fucking plague. And you behave like this. I discard the in toto and cover the rainbow to blow off empty air. Plague you. Plague you. 40 million infected people is a fucking plague you. All we can do is field a couple hundred people at a demonstration. That's not going to make anybody pay attention. Not until we get millions out there. Let the among us without sin be the first to condemn. And I say to you in year 10 the same thing I said to you in 1981 when there were 41 cases. Until we get our acts together, all of us, we are as good as dead. We want to be a man. Healthcare is a right. Healthcare is a right. Healthcare is a right. Healthcare is a right. Healthcare is a right.